Hello there and welcome back to the Sleep Science-y. You find yourself standing on a quiet shoreline, the horizon painted with that faint silver glow that only the moon seems to know how to spill across the water. The waves don't crash tonight. They hush and pull back like they're listening to some secret whispered overhead. You tilt your head, watching as the moon inches upward, glowing tin steady, and you swear the surface of the sea answers, sliding in and out, almost like the planet itself is breathing under its command. It's one of those sights that makes you think, this is peaceful, maybe even eternal. And then the cheeky little voice in your head reminds you, without the moon's constant pull, life here might be impossible, or at least nothing like you know it. You probably wouldn't survive this world without its tug of war between water and sky. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time down below. I always love seeing how many corners of the world drift together under the same story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The silver ribbon of light grows wider as the moon clears the trees, and you notice how the tide creeps just a little higher on the sand. Not much, nothing dramatic, but enough that a line of seashells glints where water didn't quite reach before. You crouch down and brush your fingers through the wet grit, hearing the faintest fizz of bubbles rising. The ocean is never truly still, it's an enormous mirror of celestial choreography. The Greeks believed the moon was Selene, driving her glowing chariot across the sky, and while they didn't have gravity equations, they still noticed that her climb into the heavens meant the sea would follow. That's a pretty sharp observation for people who thought lightning bolts were Zeus having a temper tantrum. You keep walking, letting the wet sand press cool against your toes, and your gaze keeps shifting back to the moon. There's something oddly comforting about its loyalty. It's always there, waxing or waning, never missing a night. In the Middle Ages, fishermen set out to mark their calendars not by the days of the week, but by the moon's phases, because they knew when the full face shone bright, the waters would be at their boldest, and historians still argue whether early seafarers truly understood the mechanics, or if they just noticed patterns and built myths around them. Either way, the fact remains, even without modern physics, people realized the moon had its fingers in the water's movements. You pause where driftwood lies half buried, bleached and smoothed by countless tides. The air smells faintly of salt and seaweed, a tang that makes your chest expand as though you're taking in more than just oxygen. You're breathing in history too. Think of all the times humans stood exactly where you are, staring at the moon and wondering why the water seemed to follow. Some Babylonian scholar scratching calculations into clay tablets, some Polynesian navigator memorizing the tilt of the stars and the roll of the tide, some medieval monk recording in Latin how the sea lifts itself when the moon is full. You're walking in a timeline as much as a landscape. The waves press a little closer, and you step back with a grin, joking to yourself that the moon's playing tag. You imagine it saying, "Don't ignore me, Earthling, I'm tugging at whole oceans here." And you feel like maybe you should applaud. It's subtle though, the moon doesn't crash things around like a cosmic toddler. Its force is more like an invisible handshake, a pull so steady and patient you barely notice until you've walked far enough down the beach to see how much higher the waterline has climbed. Here, in the dim hush, it's easier to sense how tides aren't just an abstract science lecture. They're happening under your feet, soaking your ankles, teasing the boundaries of land and sea. Each surge is a reminder of connection, not separation. The sky touching the ocean, the moon pulling at the earth, you standing between them like some drowsy referee with sandy toes. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the rhythm, not just waves, but a cosmic heartbeat, slow and deliberate, keeping time with the moon's arc. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you recall the quirky tidbit that ancient Roman women supposedly used crocodile dung as sunscreen during sunny beach outings. Not exactly moon-related, but it makes you chuckle. People have always found strange ways of living beside the sea, and while the Romans had aqueducts and calendars, even they noticed the link between the lunar cycle and the flood patterns of their coasts. They might not have understood Newton's gravity, but they certainly respected the moon's authority, maybe even feared it a little. The night grows cooler, the stars deepen above, and you let your feet sink into wet sand as if the earth is inviting you to stand still and simply feel. That's when it hits you. The moon doesn't just move the water, it moves you too. Maybe not literally dragging your body across the sand, but shifting something in your rhythm, pulling your thoughts slower, quieter, more tidal. Each inhale expands like a wave, each exhale recedes like foam. The moon's glow makes the shoreline a stage, and you realise you're part of the performance whether you clap or not. You trace a lazy spiral in the sand with your toe, a little doodle that the next wave will erase without ceremony. That in itself feels poetic. The moon doesn't care about your doodle. It doesn't even care about empires, castles or seawalls. Give it a few thousand years and the tides will eat them all. The ocean is loyal to the moon alone, and you're just lucky enough to watch the two of them dance. Somewhere out there, water is rushing up a different coast, retreating from another, carving bays, reshaping deltas, answering the same silver call you hear tonight. The breeze softens, and with it, your own thoughts slow. You can't help but imagine lying down right here, letting the tide creep close and whisper its secrets. The moon, steady above, watches like a quiet guardian, pulling the oceans into motion, pulling you gently towards sleep. You keep walking along the shoreline, and with every step the world feels more ancient, as though the wet sand beneath your feet has been pressed by countless generations who all stared at the same moon and puzzled over its connection to the water. Before anyone spoke of physics or equations, stories filled the gaps. Ancient peoples looked at the tides and thought, well, clearly this must be the work of gods, spirits, or perhaps some sea monster in the mood for redecorating the beach. You picture an old storyteller by the fire, gesturing toward the horizon, saying, when the moon rises, the sea obeys, and everyone nodding, partly out of awe and partly out of fear that disagreeing might offend some very moody ocean deity. The Greeks, with their flair for drama, explained tides through the goddess Selene and her shining chariot. When she guided her horses across the sky, the waters swelled to greet her. Meanwhile, in Norse mythology, it wasn't a goddess at all, but two giant wolves chasing the moon and the sun across the heavens, causing the seas to stir whenever their chase grew fierce. And in Polynesian islands, where the rhythm of the ocean meant survival, the moon was a living ancestor whose phases determined when to fish, when to sail, and when to stay home and not risk angering the deep. Historians still argue whether these myths were simply symbolic or if they encoded careful observations of real tidal cycles. Either way, they show how deeply the moon's influence seeped into human imagination. You smile at the thought of those myths, partly because they're grand and poetic, and partly because they're so wonderfully human. When in doubt, we point at the sky and say, that glowing thing, yeah, it's definitely in charge. And honestly, they weren't wrong, they just lacked the vocabulary of gravity and orbital mechanics, so they gave the moon personalities and stories instead. There's something oddly comforting about knowing that the same tides lapping at your feet were once explained as a divine horse ride or a giant wolf's paw print. As the night deepens, you imagine yourself in ancient Babylon, where early astronomers meticulously recorded lunar cycles on clay tablets. Those records, dull rows of symbols baked into mud, might not sound romantic, but they were essentially the first tide charts. By watching the moon and noting how the rivers and seas responded, they created tools for predicting when to irrigate fields or sail. Not exactly myth, not yet science, just something in between, a bridge between wonder and practicality. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe, the Maori in New Zealand used the moon to track fishing. They believed each lunar phase affected not just the tides but also the luck of the catch. On certain nights, the fish would practically leap into your net. On others, you might as well stay home and nap. You can imagine a fisherman grumbling, of course, it's the moon's fault as usual, much like you'd blame bad Wi-Fi today. As the breeze shifts, you catch the salty tang of seaweed drying on the shore and you picture coastal temples where priests once stood, chanting to the moon for safe tides. In India, some coastal communities tied rituals to lunar phases, praying that the waters would remain calm for trade voyages. And in ancient Rome, Pliny the Elder, always a font of curious trivia, wrote about the moon pulling at the seas, even if he couldn't fully explain why. He was basically the original science podcaster, dropping factoids with just enough flair to keep his readers hooked. But myths weren't always comforting. Some stories leaned into fear. Medieval Europeans whispered that witches held their Sabbaths during certain phases of the moon, using its pull to stir storms at sea. Sailors, already superstitious, avoided voyages around those nights. Historians still argue whether these tales were widespread beliefs or just exaggerations spread later, but they reflect how unsettling the ocean's mood swings could be without clear scientific understanding. When a wave swallowed a boat unexpectedly, it was easier to say witchcraft than lunar-induced gravitational bulges. You laugh softly to yourself at that thought, the idea of villagers pointing at the moon and blaming it for their soggy socks. But there's truth hidden in the humour. The moon did hold power, even if no one could see its invisible tether. And power, when unexplained, almost always breeds stories. You might not have feared wolves chasing the moon across the sky, but imagine standing in a wooden boat on a dark sea watching the water surge higher than expected. You'd probably make up a story too, just to sleep at night. The beach around you feels timeless. As though these myths are still whispered in the breeze, you bend to pick up a smooth stone, turning it over in your palm, and you imagine it as an artifact, something a storyteller might have held while spinning tales of lunar tides. You toss it back into the surf and it disappears with a soft plunk, erased like so many forgotten myths. Yet the moon keeps shining as constant as ever, whether worshipped, feared, or just quietly observed. It's easy to chuckle at old stories about wolves and gods, but think about it. Aren't we still telling lunar myths today? We still talk about lunacy during a full moon, or joke about strange behaviour when it glows bright. It's the same instinct, really, the need to explain what feels larger than us. Even with physics in hand, there's something mystical about knowing the moon is moving entire oceans. And maybe that's the lesson from these myths. Even when we understand the mechanics, the poetry still matters. As you glance back at the horizon, you notice the water has crept even closer. Not dramatically, just a steady, sly advance. It's as though the moon is reminding you, stories aside, I'm still pulling, and you let it. The sound of waves folding into the shore becomes a lullaby, blending myth and science into something older than both. You close your eyes for a moment and picture all those storytellers across centuries, all listening to the same rhythm of tide and moon. You're in good company. The waves have become steadier now, each one sliding in with a hush like the ocean clearing its throat before delivering a lecture. You watch the water draw back, then surge forward, and you realise you're seeing gravity in action. Not the kind that makes you drop your phone on your face when you're texting in bed, but a cosmic handshake between Earth and the moon. The moon doesn't have much size compared to Earth, just about 1/4 the diameter, but its gravitational pull still matters. It tugs on the oceans, stretching them ever so slightly, and because water is obedient in its own slippery way, the seas swell toward the moon. That's your first real glimpse of the tide's engine room, the invisible rope of gravity connecting sky and sea. Isaac Newton was the first to really nail this down. In 1687, when he published his Principia Mathematica, he laid out the law of universal gravitation. Everything with mass attracts everything else. The Earth pulls on the moon pulls on Earth. And voila! Tidal motion explained. But historians still argue whether Newton fully grasped all the messy details of how those bulges of water shift as the Earth rotates beneath them. Even Newton, that genius apple watcher, might have scratched his head over why the ocean sometimes seemed to misbehave compared to his equations. You shuffle your feet in the sand, thinking about how strange it is that invisible forces can shape entire landscapes. You don't feel the moon pulling at you, but technically it is. Your body, your bones, even that half-eaten granola bar in your pocket, all attracted toward the moon. Of course, the Earth's gravity holds you tighter, so you don't go bouncing skyward like an astronaut. Still, it's a humbling reminder that you're part of this constant tug-of-war, a game you never signed up for but can't opt out of. The quirky part? Gravity isn't picky. It stretches not just oceans, but the solid Earth itself. That's right. The ground beneath your feet actually bulges slightly toward the moon, though you'd need very sensitive instruments to notice. Imagine explaining that at a party. Fun fact, we're all being squished and stretched by the moon right now. Probably not the smoothest conversation starter, but it's as true, and the ocean, being liquid, just shows the effect more dramatically, sloshing around like a drink in a moving car. You pause, picturing Earth and a moon locked in this eternal dance. The moon keeps Earth's axis steady, stabilizing seasons, while also creating tides that mix the oceans and stir nutrients for marine life. Without this gravitational bond, the planet would be wilder, less predictable, basically an intergalactic reality show gone wrong. And you, fragile human wandering the beach, might never have found your way here at all. There's a whisper of history on the wind. Galileo, back in the early 1600s, tried explaining tides too, but he got it wrong. He thought tides came from Earth's rotation and its orbit around the sun. sort of like sloshing water in a bowl. Close, but no lunar cigar. Yet he wasn't entirely off base, because the sun's gravity does play a role in tides. It just shares the stage with the moon. Historians still argue whether Galileo clung to his flawed theory out of stubbornness or just because he lacked Newton's math. Either way, it's comforting to know that even geniuses sometimes fumble explanations, the way you might fumble for your house keys while they're already in your hand. The waves slide in again, licking at your ankles. You notice how gentle it feels. Almost like the ocean is demonstrating, see? This is gravity at work, nothing scary, just pull and release, pull and release. You let the rhythm sink into you, a reminder that the most powerful forces often arrive without noise or spectacle. The moon doesn't need fireworks, it just raises oceans with quiet persistence. And then there's the little-known tidbit. In the 18th century, some natural philosophers suggested that tides might be caused by the breathing of the Earth itself, like the planet inhaled and exhaled water twice a day. It sounds silly now, but think about it. If you lived in a time when invisible forces were a mystery, wouldn't you guess that the Earth was alive, sighing through its oceans? You grin at the thought, imagining Earth sprawled on a cosmic couch, groaning, "Ugh, another long day. Better exhale a tide." Above you, the moon continues its steady climb, a pale lantern in the sky. You tilt your head, marvelling at how something so far away can command such obedience from the seas. The connection is invisible but undeniable, like Wi-Fi signals. You don't see them, but without them, your whole system falls apart. And just like Wi-Fi, the moon occasionally frustrates scientists trying to track every detail of its signal. Tidal models can predict most movements, but little anomalies still surprise us, as if the moon is winking and saying, "You don't know everything about me yet." You crouch down, scoop up a handful of wet sand, and let it trickle between your fingers. Each grain is held to earth by gravity, just as the ocean is. Yet together, those grains form shorelines that the tides endlessly reshape. The balance is delicate, constant, eternal, and somewhere in that balance you find a strange comfort. The realization that even when you feel small, you're part of a vast, steady pattern, linking sea, sky, and body. The night thickens, the waves hush softer, and you feel yourself swaying slightly as though the moon has reached into your own rhythm. You think about how lucky it is that the Earth even has such a companion, a silent partner guiding the oceans. Without the moon's handshake, the seas might sit still, lifeless, stagnant. Instead, they breathe, shift, sing, and you, half dreaming now, get to listen. The shoreline darkens as the moon climbs higher, and with its ascent you notice something subtle but undeniable. The water doesn't just rise once, it bulges in two places at once. That, right there, is the moon showing off its favourite trick, the oceanic bulge. Picture Earth as a slightly squishy ball wrapped in a thin skin of water. The moon pulls the hot watery skin toward itself, stretching it out on the side closest to the moon. But here's the twist. The far side of Earth bulges too, pushed outward by inertia, like a dog's cheeks puffing out when it sticks its head out of a car window. Two bulges opposite each other, circling the planet every day. You can almost imagine the Earth waddling around in space wearing a pair of watery shoulder pads. Standing barefoot in the sand, you trace the thought backward. Every high tide you've seen is really you brushing against one of those bulges as Earth rotates through them. The seas aren't rushing across the globe so much as you're spinning into their stretched forms. It's a little disorienting, like realizing the moving walkway at the airport isn't the one doing all the work you are. And it makes the simple sight of waves sliding toward your ankles feel like part of a planetary illusion. Back in the 18th century, a French scientist named Pierre-Simon Laplace refined Newton's ideas and worked out the mathematics of how those bulges shift under the moon's tug. His equations made tide prediction more accurate for sailors, though historians still argue whether his theories fully captured the chaotic wiggle of real coastlines. After all, water isn't just sloshing in a perfect bowl, it's bumping into continents, funneled by bays, delayed by underwater ridges. No wonder mariners kept tide tables like sacred scrolls, updating them constantly, because even the best math needed a pinch of guesswork. You bend down, pick up a shell shaped like a crescent, and hold it against the horizon. It looks like a tiny echo of the moon itself. You think about those bulges as invisible tides of power, silent and patient. To the casual eye, the ocean just rises and falls, but Beneath it lies an elegant geometry, one bulge facing the moon, one bulge trailing behind like a cosmic shadow. The Earth spins, and you are tugged through this cycle twice a day. It's humbling in the same way realizing your GPS is triangulated by satellites is humbling. You depend on something you can't see. The quirky tidbit here is that even solid rock participates. The Earth's crust itself flexes about 30 centimeters twice a day, lifted and stretched by the same forces. Picture mountains subtly bobbing like surfers on invisible waves. You don't notice it underfoot, but instruments pick it up. If that doesn't make you smile, imagine explaining it in medieval times. The hills are moving. That would have gone over well at the local tavern. And here's a curious thought. Those bulges don't sit perfectly aligned with the moon. Because Earth spins faster than the moon orbits, the bulges are dragged slightly ahead, creating a kind of gravitational tug-of-war offset. This tiny misalignment is one of the reasons the moon is slowly drifting away from Earth, about 3.8 centimeters every year. Not enough to ruin your beach vacation anytime soon, but given a few 100 million years, the moon will be far enough that total eclipses won't happen anymore. You imagine some future stargazer staring up and sighing, "Back in the old days, the moon covered the sun perfectly. Now it's just a tiny dot. Lame." The surf creeps higher, lapping at a patch of dried seaweed. You can hear the faint crackle of bubbles popping as the water claims its prize. It reminds you that while the mechanics can be charted with numbers and diagrams, the lived experience of tides is always sensory. Cold water on skin, shifting sand underfoot, the hush of waves masking the mathematics. The bulges might be invisible from space, but here, they soak your toes. Historians still argue about how early civilizations conceptualized these bulges. Did the Babylonians think the whole sea literally leaned toward the moon? Did the Greeks imagine the Earth stretched like a drumhead? Records suggest they noticed the regularity, but struggled with the symmetry of two daily highs. Without satellites, you'd be forgiven for thinking the ocean just swelled once per day. After all, if you lived inland and only visited the coast occasionally, the second bulge might slip right past your calendar. The breeze ruffles your hair, and you let the idea settle in. You are standing on a planet that is never quite still, its oceans endlessly stretched, its crust quietly flexing, its moon locked in a tug strong enough to sculpt the rhythm of days. The bulges are reminders that Earth is not an island alone but part of a relationship, one body pulling on another, over and over, for billions of years. And as another wave curls in, fizzing against your ankles, you can't help but smirk at the thought. The moon is basically giving Earth a perpetual hug, just tight enough to keep the oceans moving, not so tight as to break the dance. That hug, invisible yet insistent, is what you feel now in the steady climb of the tide. The tide has been inching higher while you wander, almost sneakily, and now the shoreline feels narrower, as if the ocean has decided to scoot a little closer and share your space. This is the daily dance of high tide, the part of the cycle where the ocean finally reveals how faithfully it follows the moon's pull. Twice every day, like clockwork, the bulges you imagined for Ulia roll past, and the sea climbs up beaches, pours into estuaries, and knocks politely at the base of cliffs. You can think of it as the moon's RSVP to Earth's rotation, never late, never skipping a step. You pause to watch the water spread across the sand in shimmering sheets, leaving behind a mirror of the sky. It's oddly soothing knowing that billions of people across the globe could stand at their own coasts right now and see the same thing happening, all synced to the same lunar beat. In New England, for instance, entire communities grew up around predicting these highs and lows, with towns like Boston carefully plotting ship movements to the rhythm of the tide. Historians still argue whether the indigenous peoples of the region kept written tide records or relied purely on memory, but either way, their understanding of high water was essential for survival. The quirky thing about high tide is how differently it appears depending on where you stand. Some coasts only see a modest rise, just a few feet, barely enough to wet your shins. Others, like the Bay of Fundy in Canada, show off with the highest tidal ranges on Earth, where the water can rise and fall more than 50 feet. Imagine leaving your boat tied at the dock and returning hours later to find it dangling high above the mud like a forgotten bathtub toy. You grin, picturing the panicked sailor rushing back with extra rope, muttering, "Should have listened to the moon forecast." As you wander along the beach, your toes sinking into the saturated sand, you start noticing how high tide changes the whole landscape. Rock pools vanish under the waves, tiny crabs scurry for cover, and gulls take to the air as their buffet of stranded fish disappears. High tide is not just an event, it's a reset button, sweeping over the shore twice a day and erasing the scribbles left during low tide. The ocean is basically the world's most meticulous housekeeper, though it's the kind who moves your furniture around just to keep things interesting. There's something humbling about knowing the water you see swelling in now is part of a pattern that never stops, never pauses. The Earth rotates once every 24 hours, but the Moon orbits at its own pace, so the exact timing of high tide shifts by about 50 minutes each day. That means the morning tide you see today will arrive nearly an hour later tomorrow. Fishermen, surfers, and coastal villagers plan their lives around this slow drift, always adjusting, bargaining, never expecting permanence. You imagine someone in the 18th century glancing at a tide clock, yes, those existed, and sighing, "Ah, high water at tea time. Delightful." You kneel and let the incoming tide lap over your hands, cool and insistent. It feels alive, and in a way it is. Tides carry nutrients, stir the shallows, and bring oxygen to marine ecosystem. Without this twice-daily flush, many coastal environments would stagnate. Coral reefs, salt marshes, and mangroves rely on high tide to wash in food and sweep away waste. So when you see the sea creeping higher, it's not just a routine, it's an ecological lifeline. The Moon is basically the ocean's personal trainer, making sure it never slacks off. A soft laugh escapes you when you remember another odd historical tidbit. In medieval Europe, some people believed high tide happened because the ocean was chasing the Moon as it crossed the sky. Imagine an entire body of water running like an overeager puppy after a glowing ball. The image is ridiculous, but somehow it fits, because high tide does have that eager, forward-leaning quality. It's the moment when the ocean seems to say, "Yes, I'm here, I've arrived." The sky above deepens into velvet, the Moon a steady lantern, and you notice the swell of water has reached its quiet peak. The surf spreads farther inland, smoothing over the footprints, swallowing sandcastles, erasing human traces as though they were never there. You feel a tiny pang, your little mark on the world gone in minutes, but then a kind of peace settles in. High tide teaches humility. Nothing you build on sand lasts forever, and maybe that's the point. Historians still argue whether early coastal cities like Venice were designed with full awareness of tidal mechanics, or whether they stumbled into success by sheer luck. Either way, their survival depended on understanding when the sea would fill the canals and when it would recede. Today, the same principle guides shipping schedules, harbour management, and even beach tourism, all because of this daily lunar choreography, so reliable you can almost set your watch to it. You close your eyes, listening to the water sighing against the shore at its highest reach. It's as if the earth itself has inhaled fully, chest expanded, waiting for the slow exhale to come. You breathe with it, matching your rhythm, feeling the invisible line that runs from your lungs to the ocean, and from the ocean all the way to the Moon. The daily dance of high tide isn't just a planetary fact, it's a reminder that you too are caught in cycles larger than yourself. The waves begin to pause, their forward push softening, and then, almost without you noticing, the sea starts pulling back. What was once a determined advance is now a steady retreat, and the wide stretch of sand begins to reappear. Low tide has arrived, revealing what the ocean usually keeps hidden, as if the Moon decided it's time for the world's most discreet unboxing video. Pools of water are left behind in shallow depressions, each one a miniature aquarium glinting under the Moon's glow. Starfish cling to rocks, tiny shrimp flicker about, and seaweed unfurls like secret banners suddenly exposed to the air. You crouch beside one of these pools, peering into the still water where the night sky is mirrored perfectly. A crab scuttles sideways, giving you a suspicious glare, like it's been caught off guard by this sudden exposure. That's the charm of low tide. It turns every stretch of coastline into an explorer's paradise. The ocean withdraws just far enough to let you glimpse the scaffolding of its ecosystems. In places like Cornwall, England, entire villages once timed their clam-digging expeditions to these retreats. The rhythm was so dependable that it became woven into daily life. Historians still argue whether some coastal communities treated low tide as a sacred interval, or simply as a practical opportunity to grab dinner. The air feels sharper without the water covering so much sand. You notice the tang of salt mixed with the faint, earthy smell of seaweed drying in the night breeze. A fishing boat lies stranded on the mudflats farther out, its hull tilted like a lazy dog napping on its side. You chuckle, imagining the crew shrugging and saying, tide'll be back in a few hours. No point in panicking. That's the paradox of low tide. What looks like disaster is often just part of the cycle. There's something wonderfully theatrical about this ebb. Whole ecosystems are exposed, stage lights shining on creatures that usually hide. Mussels clamp down tightly. Barnacles wait stubbornly for the water's return, and gulls swoop in to scavenge whatever unlucky fish didn't retreat quickly enough. You watch as a heron stalks across the wet sand, long legs deliberate, neck curved like a spring waiting to strike. It's a reminder that low tide isn't just peaceful, it's opportunity, for those who know how to seize it. Quirky fact, in some places, low tide reveals ancient pathways. Off the coast of Wales, a sunken forest emerges when the water recedes far enough, exposing tree stumps thousands of years old, preserved under layers of sand and silt. Walking across that damp wood, you'd feel like a time traveller strolling in a forest the sea swallowed long before history was written. It's proof that the moon doesn't just shape the present. It occasionally pulls back the curtain on the past. The moon glows overhead, steady as ever, and you realise how much power it takes to orchestrate such drama without anyone hearing a sound. The ocean doesn't shout its retreat, it simply slips away, leaving silence in its wake. In medieval Japan, poets wrote about low tide as a metaphor for longing, the way absence sharpens awareness. The empty shoreline became a canvas for melancholy. Historians still argue whether those verses reflected practical coastal living or a more spiritual meditation, but either way, they show how deeply the ebb touched human imagination. You wander farther out onto the exposed flats, your footsteps squelching in the mud. Tiny rivulets snake toward the deeper water, weaving silver threads that catch the starlight. Each one is a miniature river rushing to rejoin the sea. You think about how, just a few hours from now, this very spot will be hidden again. Your footprints are raised without some ceremony. It's humbling and maybe even a little funny, realizing that the moon decides how long your marks will last. You build, you dig, you leave impressions, and the tide wipes them away like an editor cutting out the messy lines. A memory surfaces of old folklore. In some coastal towns, people believe the devil himself walked the beach during low tide, leaving behind cloven-hoof footprints that the returning water mercifully erased. You glance down at your own muddy steps and smirk. Relax, you tell yourself. Those are just your sandals. Still though, sir. It's a good reminder of how mystery once clung to every tidal shift. Without understanding the mechanics, people fill the silence with stories. The night grows quieter as the water continues its retreat, and you realize the ocean feels almost shy in this state. It's not roaring, not rushing. It's exposing itself, laying bare its secrets. You lean down to touch a rock coated in slippery green algae, and it feels cool, alive, as though it's been waiting patiently for this brief intermission in the ocean's cover. Low tide is not absence, it's intermission. The pause before the orchestra returns, you straighten up, stretch, and gaze back toward the edge of the water, now far in the distance. It's remarkable that something as far away as the moon could choreograph this quiet unveiling twice a day everywhere on Earth. And as you stand there on the glistening flats, your body swaying in the night breeze, you feel like part of the scene, half land, half sea, drawn into the same rhythm of a retreat and return. The shoreline has emptied itself into silence, but you know this calm won't last. The moon, steady as a metronome above you, has more choreography planned. Tonight it's setting up one of the ocean's greatest tricks, the springtide. The name doesn't mean it happens in spring, though that would be cute. It comes from the Old English word for to leap forward. And leap it does. When the sun and the moon line up in perfect celestial teamwork, their combined gravity exaggerates the ocean's rise and fall, pushing high tides even higher and dragging low tides even lower. It's like turning the volume knob on the sea all the way up just to see if your neighbours complain. You watch the water in the distance, still far out, and imagine how much more dramatic its return will be under this alignment. Every 2 weeks near the full moon and new moon, spring tides arrive like bold punctuation marks in the otherwise gentle sentence of daily tides. Coastal communities knew this long before physics offered them equations. In ancient Greece, sailors dreaded setting sail during spring tides, not because of monsters, but because the extreme currents made navigation trickier. Historians still argue whether they avoided it out of superstition or simple practicality, but either way, It became a rule of thumb whispered along docksides. The air feels heavier as you picture the sun, moon and earth lined up like celestial billiard balls. Even though the sun is so much farther away, its massive gravity still tugs on the oceans, and when it teams up with the moon, Earth doesn't stand a chance. The seas respond in kind, swelling and shrinking with a kind of showy confidence. You imagine the moon winking at the sun, saying, "Let's mess with them a bit," and the sun replying, "Fine, but only for a few days." Spring tides have a flair for drama. In places like Mont Saint-Michel in France, the difference between high and low becomes so extreme that the medieval abbey on its island can suddenly transform from being surrounded by dry sand to being engulfed in water in a matter of hours. Pilgrims centuries ago described it as a miracle, as though the ocean itself bowed before the monastery. Today, tourists still stand wide-eyed, watching cars parked unwisely vanish beneath the rising tide. You chuckle at the thought of some unlucky driver muttering, "Well, guess I'm taking the bus home." There's a quirky historical note here. During the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror supposedly timed some of his fleet's landings with the tides around the English Channel. Chronicles suggest the dramatic shifts of spring tides either helped or hindered movement of ships depending on which side paid closer attention. Historians still argue whether William truly exploited this or if it was coincidence, but the image of armoured knights waiting impatiently for the moon's permission is irresistible. Imagine trying to explain to your troops, "Sorry lads, we'll invade tomorrow. The tide's being difficult." You dig your toes into the damp sand, feeling the faint chill creeping up from below. It makes you think about how spring tides don't just affect romantic coastlines or medieval battles. They reshape ecosystems. Beaches erode faster, estuaries flush more vigorously, and salt marshes are flooded deeper than usual. For crabs, fish and seabirds, spring tides are like a grand feast, flushing new food into reach. Entire spawning cycles are synchronized with these lunar extremes, nature's way of saying dinner is served twice a month, don't be late. But extremes can also bring danger. Coastal flooding is more likely during spring tides, especially if storms coincide. History is littered with devastating examples. London's Thames Barrier exists largely because storm surges combined with spring tides once caused catastrophic floods. The barrier is a giant mechanical reminder that while the moon and sun's collaboration is predictable, it's not always gentle. You think about how fragile a city feels when the cosmos itself is willing to nudge the waterline a few extra feet. The moon glows brighter as clouds drift aside, and you imagine its quiet confidence. It doesn't brag, it doesn't shout. It simply aligns with the sun and lets physics do the rest. And here you are, a small figure on the sand marvelling at something that will repeat again and again for billions of years. You grin at the absurdity of it. People spend fortunes chasing rare astronomical events, and yet spring tides happen twice a month for free, no tickets required. The tide hasn't yet surged back to you, but you know it's coming. Stronger than usual, bold enough to reclaim the shore with extra authority. You breathe deeply, inhaling the salt air, and you feel your own chest rise like the water will, as though the moon is pulling at you too. Maybe that's the secret of spring tides. They remind you that alignment matters. When forces work together, sun, moon, earth, the result is undeniable, a surge you can't ignore. The night is quiet, but you can feel the balance shifting again. Where spring tides roar with extremes, their counterpart, the neap tides, arrive with a whisper. You glance at the moon overhead, tilted off from the sun's path, and you sense the alignment is broken. The moon tugs one way, the sun tugs another, and the ocean, caught in the middle, shrugs like a teenager asked to clean their room. The result is subtle tides, smaller highs, softer lows, a kind of cosmic retreat from drama. You picture Earth's oceans as a great blanket. During spring tides, the moon and sun grab the same corner and yank hard, stretching it taut. But during neap tides, one pulls north, the other south, and the blanket barely moves at all. Twice a month, this gentler pattern repeats, during the first and third quarters of the moon, when the two celestial bodies meet at right angles. High tide doesn't reach quite as far, low tide doesn't retreat quite as far. And the whole rhythm feels muted, as if the ocean is catching its breath between shows. The sand beneath your feet feels firmer now, as though it knows the sea won't be charging quite so boldly tonight. You think of how ancient coastal dwellers must have noticed this difference, how fishermen centuries ago realised their nets came back lighter during neap tides. Historians still argue whether the word neap itself came from Old Anglo-Saxon roots meaning scanty, or if it drifted in from some nautical slang. Either way, the name fits. These tides are stingier, holding back the sea's usual enthusiasm. You stroll across the damp flats, and the evidence is right there. The rack line, that border of seaweed and driftwood, sits lower than the dramatic one carved by spring tides. The beach looks calmer, less battered, as though the moon has put the ocean on a leash. You grin at the thought, imagining the sun scolding, not so much tonight, while the moon sulks. But I like pulling. In some harbours, neap tides are almost a blessing. Sailors can moor their boats with less worry of ropes snapping under the strain of huge water-level swings. Cargo ships unloading in shallow ports breathe easier during neaps, the gentler tides buying them a margin of safety. The quirky twist: in other places, neaps are an inconvenience. In estuaries where strong flushing keeps water fresh, reduced tidal movement can mean stagnant pools and stronger smells. You chuckle, imagining some villager centuries ago declaring, "The moon must be lazy tonight, the harbour stinks." The glow from the moon seems softer, though you know it's just your imagination. Still, the sense of restraint lingers. You think of tidal mills in medieval Europe, stone structures that trapped water at high tide and released it at low to turn grinding wheels. During neap tides, those mills ran with less force, making flour production sluggish. Entire villages depended on that subtle difference, waiting impatiently for the next spring tide to restore the water's power. Historians still argue whether some lords deliberately scheduled feasts to coincide with stronger tides, knowing bread would be more plentiful. You pause at a shallow pool left behind, where a cluster of periwinkles clings to exposed rocks. They're perfectly fine with neap tides. Their little world doesn't need drama, and maybe that's the lesson the ocean offers here. Not every cycle has to be extreme. Sometimes equilibrium is the story. You find yourself breathing slower, in rhythm with the subdued hush of the waves, as though the moon's gentle restraint has reached into your own pulse. A quirky smile spreads across your face as you recall how Shakespeare used the phrase "neaped like a dried eel" in Antony and Cleopatra to describe something weak and withered. Even in Elizabethan times, people recognized neap tides as the quieter sibling in the tidal family. You can almost hear an old sailor scoffing, "Ah, it's only neaps, nothing worth writing home about." And yet here you are, centuries later, standing on the same coast, marvelling at their quiet precision. The night deepens, stars freckle the sky, and you notice how the absence of drama actually makes the world feel steadier. Spring tides might impress tourists, but neap tides lull the planet into calm. They are the ocean's sigh, the slow exhale after holding its breath. You feel it in your chest, your body softening into the same rhythm, as if the moon has gently told both sea and soul to take it easy tonight. The shoreline glimmers faintly under the moon, but now the water has turned restless in a new way. After the gentleness of neap tides, you sense a shift, a pull that isn't just about height, but movement. The tide isn't only rising and falling, it's running, flowing like a river that can't decide where its bed should be. This is the ebb current, the steady draw of water rushing back out to sea as the tide falls. You feel it in the small rivulets slicing across the sand, tiny veins feeding into a larger artery of retreat. Step closer, and the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The tide pools you admired earlier begin to drain, their surfaces trembling as thin streams carve escape routes. Farther out you can see channels glinting under moonlight deeper and faster, the water moving with a determination you wouldn't expect from something so vast. People often imagine tides as sluggish, slow-motion affairs, but here's the secret. In narrow inlets and bays, ebb currents can be stronger than many rivers. There are harbours where the sea gushes out with the force of a freight train, and sailors time their departures with precision or risk, being swept like driftwood. You grin, imagining some 18th century captain, barking orders, "We wait for slack water, lads," or Neptune himself will drag us backward. Historians still argue whether ancient seafarers fully understood these ebbing rivers of the sea, or simply memorized the safest windows by trial and error. Either way, their survival depended on respecting the current's strength. Closer to shore, you kneel beside a trickling channel and dip your hand in. The pull is subtle, but it's there, tugging your fingers seaward, whispering that even here, at ankle depth, the ocean is on the move. You let your hand hover in the stream and it feels like placing your palm over a heartbeat. Steady, insistent, impossible to resist. The quirky thought crosses your mind. If water molecules had little passports, they'd be stamped twice daily, checked in and checked out by the moon's immigration office. In the distance, a stranded fishing boat tilts further as the ebb gnaws away at the water beneath it. You imagine the fisherman waiting nearby, grumbling good-naturedly. Low tide is predictable, yes, but a draining surge can be dramatic, exposing rocks, shoals and sandbanks that looked harmless only hours before. Entire coastlines reveal their hidden hazards under the watch of the ebb. You can picture a medieval sailor stepping onto a suddenly exposed reef and muttering, "Well, that wasn't on the map." The air smells sharper now, the tang of salt mingled with the faint scent of exposed seaweed and mud. It's the smell of transition, the scent of the ocean bearing its bones. You wander farther out on the flats, watching streams gather speed in deeper gullies. Each one seems purposeful, as though the moon herself drew blueprints for their escape routes. The ebb current is no chaotic retreat. It's organised, disciplined, like soldiers filing back to camp after a long parade. Quirky fact, in some estuaries, the ebb is so strong that locals call it the river that runs backward. The Bay of Fundy, already famous for its outrageous tidal range, has currents that can rip past at several knots, fast enough that kayakers joke about needing rocket boosters to paddle upstream. You chuckle at the image, imagining some stubborn adventurer declaring, "I can handle it," before being whisked away like a rubber duck in a fire hose. Historians still argue whether the Vikings, masters of tides and currents, deliberately used ebb flows to speed their longships home. Some sagas describe journeys that seemed impossibly fast, and modern scholars suspect they might have ridden outgoing tides like surfers catching a perfect wave. It's a reminder that while the ebb can look like absence, it can also be an ally, a shortcut gifted by the moon. The moon itself hangs higher now, silver light spreading across the exposed sand like spilled milk. You stand still, listening. The water hisses faintly as it drains, thousands of tiny sounds merging into one soft chorus. The rhythm is hypnotic. Push, pull, retreat, return. Your own breath sinks again, chest falling with the tide's outflow, as though you too are being drawn gently toward the horizon. The ebb reminds you that tides aren't only about vertical drama, they're horizontal too, rivers that come and go without ever staying long enough to be named on a map. You picture the ocean as a living creature inhaling and exhaling blood rushing through veins twice daily, and suddenly the science feels less mechanical, more organic. You're not just watching water drain, you're watching a pulse. You let the breeze wash over you, cool and damp, and whisper to yourself that there's comfort in this departure. The sea is not abandoning you, it's simply keeping its promise, making room for the next return. And as the last trickles around your feet slide seaward, you feel the truth of it. Even retreat is part of the dance. A rhythm set by the moon, steady as breath, eternal as time. The beach is stretched wide now, glistening with shallow pools and snaking channels. But you know it won't stay this way for long. The ebb has had its turn, and now the tide begins to reverse its script. Slowly, almost shyly at first, the flood current stirs, pushing water back toward the shore. You watch as the little rivulets that once ran seaward hesitate, falter, and then turn, flowing inland like soldiers pivoting on command. This is the flood tide, the steady return of the sea, as if the moon had pressed rewind on the entire coastline. It starts subtly, you barely notice at first, but then it gathers, a creeping insistence. The exposed sand flats you walked earlier shrink under a thin sheet of water. You can hear it too, a different kind of music. The hissing drain of the ebb is gone, replaced by a muffled lap, a hushed arrival. You smile, realizing that the flood tide is less like a wave crashing and more like time itself sneaking forward. No drama, just inevitability. Historically, this was the tide mariners trusted most. Flood currents could carry ships inland, sweeping them gently but firmly toward harbours and rivers. Roman merchants sailing up the Thames or the Seine planned their journeys around the moon's schedule. Their cargoes of wine and olive oil literally lifted toward marketplaces by lunar gravity. Historians still argue whether some Roman settlements existed primarily because their harbours lined up perfectly with favourable flood tides. Whatever the case, entire economies once rose and fell on this slow, predictable push of water. You crouch again to touch the water's edge, cool and climbing, and you feel the strength hidden in its patience. Flood currents can rival major rivers in speed, particularly in narrow straits. In places like the Pentland Firth in Scotland, flood tides roar with such ferocity that modern engineers consider them for tidal power plants. Imagine the moon casually charging your phone just by pulling the ocean back to shore. The idea makes you chuckle. Sorry, can't text right now, waiting for the tide to recharge my battery. There's something hypnotic about watching the ocean reclaim what it only recently surrendered. That stranded fishing boat you saw earlier begins to right itself, rocking gently as the water slips back under its hull. The mudflats grow slick again, pools reform, and crabs scuttle back into hiding as if nothing unusual ever happened. Flood tide has a way of erasing absence, smoothing the landscape into wholeness again. You can't help but think of it as the ocean's version of forgiveness. No matter how far it pulled away, it always returns. Quirky tidbit. In Venice centuries ago, locals had their own name for the flood tide, Aqua Alta, the high water. It was both a blessing and a curse. The flood brought life and trade into the canals, but when the moon and weather conspired, it also flooded squares and churches. Venetians grew so accustomed to its rhythm that they invented elevated walkways just to stroll through it. You imagine a Venetian shrugging elegantly, "Yes, the moon ruined my shoes again, pass the espresso." The moon itself beams above you as though it takes pride in this reversal. You think of how neatly the system balances. One side of the cycle drains, the other refills. It's not chaos, it's choreography. The flood tide's timing, like the ebbs, shifts by about 50 minutes each day, sliding across calendars with quiet stubbornness. Fishermen still keep their lives pinned to these charts, launching at the flood to ride the sea inward, returning on the ebb to let the current sweep them home. The rhythm is as old as fishing itself, as steady as the moon's path. Historians still argue whether Viking longships relied more on rowing power or on these tidal surges when raiding rivers like the Seine. Some accounts describe fleets gliding silently inland under cover of night, carried not by human effort but by the flood. If true, it means the moon itself played a role in history's most feared invasions, quiet partner in conquest. You grin, picturing a Viking captain glancing up at the sky and muttering, "Nice work, moon, keep it steady." The water creeps higher around your feet, wrapping your ankles in cool silk. You feel the gentle tug forward, a reminder that the ocean isn't just returning, it's inviting. Flood tide doesn't crash the way waves do. It insinuates itself, convincing you to step closer, to follow the waterline as it rises. The sensation makes you sway, as if your own body is leaning into the lunar pull. You take a slow breath and let the moment settle in. The flood tide is patient but unstoppable. It doesn't care about your footprints or your sandcastles or the walls humans have built to hold it back. It knows it will always return again and again, with the moon as its metronome. And standing there, with the water climbing steadily around you, you realise you're part of its rhythm too, pulled forward, drawn inward, carried along on a current older than history. The water keeps creeping higher, but suddenly you imagine it behaving differently, not as a slow, steady creep, but as a wild charge. That's the strange phenomenon of a tidal bore, one of the moon's more dramatic tricks. Unlike the gentle flood that's been sliding back toward your ankles, a tidal bore arrives like a wall of water racing upriver, reversing the flow in seconds. It's as if the moon decided, enough with the subtle nudges, let's give them a real show. Tidal bores are rare, but unforgettable. They occur in rivers that narrow just so, where incoming tides funnel with such force that they don't ease their way upstream. They stampede. Imagine standing on the bank of the Qiantang River in China, hearing a distant roar, and then watching a wave taller than a house surge against the current, sweeping paths and debris before it. Locals call it the Silver Dragon, and they've celebrated and feared it for centuries. Historians still argue whether its earliest records were written as scientific observations or as omens, but either way, it's been crashing upriver long before smartphones could capture the spectacle. You picture yourself in that crowd, clutching your bag of street food, feeling the ground tremble as the bore barrels past. People today actually surf it, yes, surf it, riding for miles on a single wave. You chuckle, imagining explaining that to ancient fishermen. We voluntarily balance on planks of wood while the river tries to eat us. They'd probably shake their heads and mutter, humans are doomed. The quirky thing is, not all tidal bores are terrifying. In England's River Severn, the Severn bore winds its way through farmland twice a year, and locals gather at dawn to watch surfers chase it along the bends. Entire websites track its predicted times and heights, like lunar rock concerts, scheduled down to the minute. You smile, picturing a fan yelling, "This is the best bore ever," a phrase that makes sense only if you've seen one. But boulder bores can be deadly. In the 1800s, small villages along the Amazon's Rio Araguari were sometimes destroyed by its tidal surge, a bore so strong it tore apart canoes and flattened houses along its banks. The locals called it the Pororoca, meaning great roar. Some claimed it sounded like 1,000 angry oxen charging at once. You shiver slightly, imagining that thunder rolling across the jungle long before anyone knew the moon was to blame. As you wander along your quiet beach tonight, the idea feels surreal. Here, the tide returns in whispers, but elsewhere, rivers literally reverse direction twice a day. It's the same moon overhead, the same gravity, yet the result is wildly different depending on geography. Historians still argue whether ancient engineers in Mesopotamia ever built irrigation systems resilient enough to handle mini-tidal bores in the Tigris-Euphrates delta. Records hint at sudden floods, though no one can say for sure if they were bore-driven or just seasonal surges. Either way, the moon was meddling in agriculture as much as in seafaring. The moon glows down, steady and innocent, while you imagine its reputation in those places. Not gentle guardian, not poetic muse, but trickster, capable of flipping rivers upside down with a single pull. You laugh softly at the thought of a villager telling a child, "The moon is mischievous, it can make the river run backward," and the child staring wide-eyed, unsure whether to be afraid or impressed. You pause at a tide pool, listening to the gentle lap of waves, and you can almost hear the echo of those bores in the distance, like faint thunder rolling across another world. The air is calm here, but you picture the chaos elsewhere. Waves swallowing riverbanks, trees rattling in the surge, fishermen scrambling. The contrast is striking. One moon, one force, infinite outcomes. The quirky fact that tickles you most is how some tidal bores became local festivals. In China, people once launched boats decorated like dragons into the silver dragon bore, treating its arrival as both spectacle and ritual. In modern times, surfers risk their lives to ride it, cheering when they stay upright for a mile or two. The moon, it seems, has always been part scientist, part entertainer, part chaos gremlin. You tilt your head back, gazing at the moon again, and smile. Even here, in your calm corner of the world, you feel connected to those roaring rivers. You're reminded that the tides aren't uniform. They're wild, varied, surprising. They can soothe you to sleep or wake you with a crash. Tonight you get the gentle version, but somewhere out there the moon is flexing its muscles, driving a wall of water upstream like a cosmic prank. And somehow that makes you love it even more. The surf settles back into its quieter rhythm, and you wander farther along the shoreline, noticing how the landscape itself seems sculpted by these endless comings and goings. The moon doesn't just move water for a night's entertainment, it's been shaping entire shorelines for eons. Beaches, marshes, deltas, mudflats. These aren't accidents, they're the signatures of tides written into the land. Every grain of sand you feel under your toes has been rolled, sifted, and placed by waves that rose and fell in tune with lunar gravity. The beach is less a permanent structure and more a diary that the moon keeps editing twice a day. You glance behind you, where the rack line curves across the sand, a ragged necklace of seaweed and driftwood marking the high tide's most recent reach. These lines, repeated over years and centuries, build dunes, pile debris, and slowly change coastlines. In places like the Netherlands, where land and sea have fought a quiet battle for centuries, people learned to work with these tidal patterns, building dikes and canals that tamed, but never fully defeated, the moon's sculpting hand. Historians still argue whether early Dutch communities realised they were working against the moon itself, or just thought of the sea as a stubborn neighbour. Either way, their survival depended on reading those rack lines as carefully as scripture. You crouch to pick up a handful of wet sand, letting it run through your fingers like sugar. The moon, in its patient tugging, is the reason this sand exists at all. Rocks are broken by waves, rolled into pebbles, ground into grains, and spread across beaches in wide, shimmering sheets. You smile at the thought that every castle you ever built as a child was technically a gift from the moon. No moon, no tides, no sand, no sandcastles, no childhood bragging rights. That's cosmic engineering with a personal touch. Farther along, you find a salt marsh where grasses ripple in the faint breeze. At high tide, these flats vanish beneath the water, but at low tide they reveal themselves, muddy and alive. Salt marshes thrive precisely because of tidal flooding. They need the rhythm of water washing in, bringing nutrients, then draining out, leaving oxygen for roots. Without the moon's discipline, this delicate ecosystem would collapse. And yet, when you look at it, all you see is a quiet stretch of grass, buzzing faintly with insects. It's easy to forget how much power hums beneath its calm surface. Quirky fact, in the 19th century, salt marsh hay was so prized in New England that farmers built elaborate fences to protect their tidal meadows. They called the harvest salt haying, and it depended entirely on knowing when tides would flood the fields and when they'd leave them dry enough to work. Entire livelihoods, and not a few family squabbles, came down to the moon's reliability. You chuckle, picturing a farmer shaking a fist at the sky. "You're late, moon! My hay is soggy!" But it's not just humans who rely on tidal architecture. Migratory birds time their journeys around the mudflats exposed at low tide, feasting on worms and shellfish. Horseshoe crabs lay eggs on beaches precisely when tides can carry their young safely out to sea. Coral reefs too depend on the flushing action of tides to sweep away waste and bring in fresh nutrients. The moon, it seems, is not only a sculptor, but also a gardener, pruning and feeding in cycles we often overlook. You stroll past a line of driftwood stacked like a barricade. Each piece, smoothed and pale, is proof of tide's rearranging work. Some cultures saw driftwood as sacred, believing it was placed intentionally by the sea to guide travellers. Historians still argue whether Viking navigators relied on drift patterns for clues about currents and coastlines, or whether that's just romantic storytelling added later. Either way, the idea is appealing. The moon not only pulls ships across the water, but leaves clues on shore like a cosmic breadcrumb trail. The moon above you seems to glow with a quiet satisfaction, as though it knows how much of Earth's story it has written, without ever lifting a pen. Coastlines are never truly finished. They are drafts, revised twice daily. What looks like permanence is really negotiation. Sand carried away, deposited elsewhere, marshes built up, dunes eroded, deltas shifted. Think of the Nile, the Mississippi, the Ganges, mighty rivers whose deltas only exist because the tides patiently shape their mouths, spreading silt into wide, fertile fans. Without those fans, some of history's greatest civilizations might never have flourished. You pause to take in the sound around you. It's not just waves now, it's the muffled rustle of grasses, the faint plop of water draining off the marsh, the distant cry of gulls circling over exposed flats. All of it is tidal music, composed by the moon, performed on Earth. You breathe deeply, feeling the damp salt air cool your lungs. And you realise that you're walking not just a shoreline, but a sculpture gallery, every curve and contour etched by gravity's patient hand. And as the tide continues its slow climb, nibbling at the marsh edge, you smile at the thought. Shorelines aren't borders at all. They're conversations, written in water, erased and rewritten twice a day. And tonight, you're lucky enough to eavesdrop on the moon side of the dialogue. The water keeps sliding back toward the marsh, filling the hollows it abandoned earlier, and you realise the tides are more than just scenery. They're clocks, calendars, life itself. All along the coast, creatures have wired their existence to the moon's rhythm. Crabs scuttle out during low tide to forage, only to vanish back into burrows before the flood sweeps in. Mussels and clams open their shells as the tide rises, feasting on plankton-rich water, then snap shut again when the sea retreats. The entire shoreline is an orchestra, and the moon is waving the baton. You kneel by a tide pool where anemones sway like sleepy dancers. Their tentacles, delicate and pale, wave as though bowing to the lunar conductor. It's humbling to think that these creatures don't own watches, don't own calendars, yet they know the exact moment to feed and spawn or retreat. Their clock is older and far more reliable than any human invention. Historians still argue whether early coastal peoples noticed these biological rhythms first and then tied them to the moon, or whether they recognized the lunar cycle and only later connected it to marine life. Either way, the moon was the first calendar, its pull written not in numbers but in muscle, shell and fin. A warm breeze drifts across your cheek as you recall the most spectacular example: corals. In tropical seas, whole reefs spawn in unison, releasing billions of eggs and sperm into the water during certain phases of the moon. Divers describe it as swimming through an underwater snowstorm, A blizzard of life triggered by lunar light and tide. Miss the timing by a day, and the chance for fertilization dwindles. It's an entire world in lockstep with the moon. Proof that life itself trusts its pull. You chuckle softly, thinking how humanity struggles to coordinate group chat while corals spanning miles manage to synchronize reproduction perfectly. And then there are the horseshoe crabs, older than the dinosaurs, still timing their breeding to spring tides. On nights when the water rises highest, they crawl ashore in shimmering masses, laying eggs where the waves can carry their young back to sea. Shorebirds migrating thousands of miles plan their journeys around this lunar feast, gorging on the eggs to fuel their flights. You glance up at the moon, grinning at the thought. It doesn't just move water, it schedules banquets for entire ecosystems. Humans, of course, joined the guest list too. Fishermen for millennia have trusted the tides, launching boats at flood, dragging nets during ebb, and setting traps where the waterline shifts. Polynesian navigators read both the stars and the tides to cross open oceans, their survival depending on that rhythm. In Brittany, France, fishermen built stone walls across tidal flats, fish weirs that trapped schools as the water receded. Quirky detail. Some of those weirs are still visible today, centuries old, their outlines sketched in seaweed and barnacles. The moon, without ever lifting a finger, became humanity's business partner. You wander farther, the wet sand gleaming under lunar light, and think of farming communities too. In some cultures, people believe crops should be planted by the moon, tying their sowing to tidal calendars. Even today, you can buy lunar gardening guides promising better harvests if you follow the phases. Historians still argue whether there's real science behind it or if it's pure tradition dressed in celestial poetry. Either way, it shows how deep the moon's pull runs, not just in water, but in human imagination. You stop near a patch of exposed rocks, watching limpets cling with quiet tenacity. Their entire survival strategy is tied to the tide. Clamp down at low water to avoid drying out, release again when the sea returns. It's simple, efficient, ancient. The moon sets the schedule and the creatures obey, not out of superstition but necessity. You smile at the honesty of it. No arguments, no debates, just pure adaptation. The quirky tidbit that surfaces in your mind is this. Some species of worms actually rise from the sand to spawn only on certain nights when the tide is just right. Coastal communities in Samoa even host festivals around this, collecting the worms for food. Imagine planning your dinner party not around the clock but around the moon's exact mood. You laugh softly, imagining a modern host saying, "Sorry, can't serve appetizers until the tide agrees." The air grows cooler, and you feel yourself slowing, swaying in rhythm with the waves. It occurs to you that you too are mostly water, and though you don't slosh dramatically with the tide, your body is still touched by the same forces. Scientists sometimes debate whether the moon subtly influences human biological rhythms. Historians still argue whether ancient midwives timed births with lunar phases because of observed patterns or sheer belief. The data remains inconclusive, but the stories persist, woven into folklore like seaweed and driftwood. You take a long breath, letting it stretch, soften, and fade, just as the tide itself softens around your ankles. The moon above is patient, guiding cycles within cycles, oceans rising and falling, reefs spawning, crabs marching, birds feasting, and now, as you feel your own eyelids grow heavier, you realize you're sinking too, caught in that same pull. The tide doesn't just move the sea, it moves life, it moves time, and tonight it moves you into rest. The moon hangs steady in the sky, and as the tide continues its slow climb, you realize its influence hasn't only shaped creatures and coastlines, it has shaped human history itself. Wherever there was trade, wherever there were ports, tides dictated the rhythm. Ancient harbours weren't just stone walls and wooden docks, they were calendars carved into shorelines, built in obedience to the moon. Without understanding its mechanics, people quickly learned that commerce had to bow to lunar time. Imagine Alexandria in the days of the Ptolemies, its grand lighthouse shining over the Mediterranean. Ships laden with papyrus, grain and glassware couldn't simply glide in whenever they pleased. The timing of their arrivals depended on whether the tide was high enough to lift them safely into harbour. Historians still argue whether the lighthouse also doubled as a tide marker, its keepers recording when the waters reached certain levels. What's certain is that without the tides, Alexandria's bustling markets would have been far less reliable. You stroll farther down the beach, toes sinking in the cool sand, and picture London in the Middle Ages. The Thames wasn't just a river, it was a tidal highway. Barges and ferries drifted with the flood tide upstream, then rode the ebb back out to the estuary. Merchants planned their schedules like stage managers, ensuring goods moved in rhythm with the moon. It's a funny thought. The bustling medieval city, with its markets and shouting hawkers, all ultimately kept on time not by bells or clocks, but by a glowing orb 240,000 miles away. Quirky tidbit: in the 9th century, dock workers in Liverpool invented a phrase, dock time, which meant adjusting work hours according to the tide rather than the clock. If high tide came at 3 a.m, well, that's when you showed up. Imagine explaining that to your boss today. Sorry, can't do the morning meeting, the moon says I have to nap until noon. Yet for centuries that was simply how shipping worked. No one questioned it. You pause and gaze out at the horizon, picturing fleets of Viking longships slipping into estuaries under cover of the flood tide. Chronicles hint that their sudden inland raids relied on perfect tidal timing, allowing them to glide silently upriver to strike towns unprepared. Historians still argue whether their mastery of tides was deliberate genius or just practical seamanship. Either way, it gave them an edge, making the moon an unwitting accomplice in conquest. You grin at the absurdity of it. The same force that lets you skim for shells at low tide also helped warriors terrorize half of Europe. The moon's pull wasn't always about war, though. In Japan, tidal rice paddies were engineered to flood and drain in sync with lunar cycles, using seawater to fertilize crops. Farmers turned the daily breath of the ocean into a predictable irrigation system, feeding communities for centuries. It was trade of a different kind, grain for salt water, food for rhythm. The ingenuity makes you nod in admiration. Humans have always been clever enough to turn the moon into a silent business partner. The air grows cooler, and you imagine bustling marketplaces along tidal rivers, spices in Calicut, silk in Canton, amber in the Baltic. All of it moved by boats that couldn't ignore the moon. Even in the 20th century, before satellites and GPS, shipping companies still printed tide tables the way they printed payroll slips. Essentials, not extras. The quirky thought strikes you. Somewhere out there, an accountant once blamed a missing shipment not on storms, not on pirates, but on the moon. You dig your toes into the damp sand, feeling how solid yet temporary it is, and you realise that global trade, the backbone of empires, was built on something as fluid as tidal flow. Without reliable high water, ports would silt, ships would ground, and commerce would falter. The moon, in its quiet orbit, became the hidden architect of prosperity. You smirk, thinking of emperors and kings bragging about their riches, never admitting they owed part of their success to a celestial body they couldn't control. Historians still argue about Venice, that improbable city of canals. Was it chosen because tides made it defensible, flooding marshy ground and turning it into a lagoon fortress? Or did settlers simply adapt later, realizing the moon's quirks had given them both a moat and a highway? Either way, the city thrived, living proof that commerce could bloom on shifting water if you knew how to dance with the tides. The waves whisper at your ankles, and you can almost hear the creak of ropes, the call of sailors, the clang of cargo hitting docks. The ocean carries not only salt and life, but the memory of markets, empires, invasions and harvests. Each tide that rises now is linked to every tide that once lifted a Roman galley, a Viking ship, a Venetian gondola. It's all one long cycle written across centuries. And as you stand there breathing in the salt air, you feel strangely humbled. The moon hasn't just pulled oceans, it's pulled history along with them. Without it, human trade might have looked very different, maybe even impossible. You smile softly, realizing the truth. Your world, your cities, your shelves been stocked with goods from faraway places, all owe your quiet debt to the lunar tide. The moon glows high above you now, Yi. And as you watch its silver light spill across the water, another thought drifts into your mind. This dance of tides is not a free performance. Every push and pull, every bulge and ebb has a cost. Over billions of years, the tides have been slowly stealing energy from Earth itself. With every cycle, a fraction of Earth's rotation is siphoned away and transferred to the moon, nudging it farther from us. That pale lantern in the sky isn't fixed. It's drifting inch by inch, year by year, moving away at about 3.8 centimeters annually. It doesn't sound like much, but over geological time it's a marathon, not a sprint. You look up and imagine the moon as a teenager slowly packing its bags, eager for independence but not in a hurry. Right now it sits a comfortable distance away, but rewind the clock 1.5 billion years, and it was much closer, close enough that tides would have been enormous, perhaps hundreds of feet high, surging across primitive coastlines. Imagine standing on some ancient shore, the sky filled by a moon 3 times larger, while water thundered inland like an unstoppable wall. Historians still argue whether early life on Earth actually relied on those dramatic tides, their mixing of shallow pools sparking the chemistry that led to the first fragile organisms. If so, then we owe our very existence to the moon's once clingy embrace. You grin at the thought, because it means without the moon's constant meddling, you might not even be here to watch it shine. The quirky fact is that scientists have measured fossilized coral reefs and shells that reveal daily rhythms from hundreds of millions of years ago. Back then, Earth spun faster, days were shorter, about 21 hours long, and the moon sat closer, looming brighter. Those tiny ancient creatures, by recording daily growth lines in their skeletons, accidentally left us a lunar diary proving that our satellite really is inching away. It's like the moon left its breakup notes scrawled in calcium carbonate. The sand beneath your feet feels steady, but you realize it's part of a planet gradually slowing down. In millions of years, Earth's days will be longer, not because of human schedules, but because the tides keep dragging their invisible brakes. The energy Earth loses doesn't vanish, it goes into pushing the moon outward. You picture the moon surfing away, coasting into wider orbit, while Earth yawns and spins more slowly. There's a sleepy inevitability to it, like watching 2 dancers grow older, their steps widening as they drift apart. You pause to watch a wave climb up the beach and retreat, erasing your footprints. It feels strangely poetic. Just as the tide erases your marks, the tides themselves are erasing Earth's spin. The process is subtle, relentless, unstoppable. The moon is patient. It has all the time in the universe. You chuckle softly, thinking how humans stress over deadlines, while the moon plays the ultimate long game. There's a quirky story tucked in here too. In the 1960s, scientists left mirrors on the moon during the Apollo missions. Even now, astronomers fire lasers at them and measure the return time, tracking exactly how far the moon has drifted. It's precise down to millimeters. So when you hear that 3.8 centimeters per year, it's not guesswork. It's literally measured with laser tag across 240,000 miles. You shake your head in amusement. Humanity, inventors of disco balls and fast food, also decided to play interplanetary laser tag with the moon. Historians still argue what this drift will mean far into the future. One day, total solar eclipses will disappear because the moon will no longer appear large enough to cover the sun. Imagine future stargazers sighing in disappointment. Back in the old days, the moon perfectly blocked the sun. Must have been magical. You smile at the irony. For us, it's a normal event. For them, it will be an impossible dream. The thought sobers you a little, but then the waves sigh against the shore again, and you feel steadied. Yes, the moon is drifting away, but it's not abandoning us. Even as it retreats, its pull continues. Tides will keep rising and falling, just a little weaker with each passing epoch. The process is so slow that no one alive will notice the difference, and that's oddly comforting. The universe is in motion, but not in a hurry. You tilt your head back, letting the moon fill your vision. It looks steady, eternal, unchanged, but you know better now. It's been closer, it will be farther, and right now, you're living in the middle of its journey. That's a privilege, really. You're witnessing an arrangement that billions of years from now will no longer exist. The moon's retreat is history unfolding in real time, too slow for you to see but undeniable nonetheless. The water curls around your ankles again, cool and insistent, as though reminding you that the moon's work is still here, still alive. You smile softly, whispering thanks to the silver companion above. It may be drifting, but tonight its pull is close enough to move the sea and close enough to move you. The waves hush against the shore, steady and familiar, but your thoughts drift farther than this beach, farther even than Earth itself. If the moon can pull entire oceans here, what might be happening out there? On other worlds, circling other planets? You glance up at the sky, speckled with stars, and imagine a gallery of moons, each one tugging at its host world in strange alien rhythms. Tides, it turns out, aren't just Earth's trick. They echo across the solar system, shaping icy crusts, hidden oceans, and perhaps even the possibility of life. Take Jupiter's moon Europa, for instance. Beneath its cracked, frozen shell lies a vast ocean, maybe twice the volume of all Earth's seas. That ocean doesn't stay liquid because of sunshine. Europa is way too far for warmth. Instead, it's the pull of Jupiter and neighbouring moons stretching and squeezing Europa like a stress ball. This tidal flexing generates heat, enough to keep water from freezing solid. Without tides, Europa would be a lifeless ice cube drifting in the dark. With tides, it may host alien seas teeming with unknown creatures. Historians still argue whether early astronomers ever guessed that moons could hold oceans, or whether that's a leap only modern science could make. You smile, picturing some alien crab-like creature crawling along Europa's ocean floor, totally unaware that its existence depends on the same tidal process you see here tonight. The quirky fact is that NASA once described Europa's interior as kneaded like bread dough by tidal forces. You chuckle at the comparison. Imagine the moon kneading Earth's oceans like pizza dough every day. Suddenly the idea of cosmic cuisine doesn't feel so far-fetched. And then there's Saturn's moon Enceladus, even smaller yet spewing geysers of salty water hundreds of miles into space. Its orbit around Saturn stretches and compresses it until fissures open at the South Pole, releasing plumes so powerful they feed Saturn's E-ring. The moon's role here on Earth feels subtle by comparison. Gentle waves, quiet bulges, yet in the outer solar system tides can crack worlds wide open. The same principle, different stage. You glance at the wet sand shimmering around your feet, and you realise the universality of it. Tides are not an earthbound quirk, but a cosmic rule. Wherever there's gravity and something flexible, water, ice, even rock, there will be tides. The thought makes you grin. Somewhere out there, an alien might be walking along its own shoreline, icy, methane, who knows, marvelling at how their moon pulls the world's surface into motion. Two dreamers on different planets, both lulled by the same physics. Historians still argue whether Galileo, who first saw Jupiter's moons through his telescope in 1610, ever guessed they might be tidal players. His notes brim with awe at the tiny points of light, but nowhere did he write, "Hey, these little guys might be stirring hidden oceans." Yet that's exactly what they do. His discovery was the beginning of understanding that tides weren't Earth's monopoly, but part of a wider cosmic symphony. The quirky thought hits you. Even black holes create tides. Astronomers talk about spaghettification, the process of being stretched into long strands if you fall into one. It's extreme tidal force, just minus the friendly moon, and plus a whole lot of doom. You chuckle nervously, grateful that Earth's tidal partner is a pale, polite satellite and not a cosmic monster with bad table manners. The breeze shifts, and you close your eyes, imagining yourself on a beach not of sand but of methane ice under a dim sun. Watching strange seas rise and fall, Titan, Saturn's largest moon, has lakes of liquid methane and ethane, and tides ripple through them too. Not as dramatic as Earth's, but still there. The pull of Saturn gently nudging alien waves. Somewhere, if there are creatures paddling those lakes, their lives are scheduled by tides as surely as horseshoe crabs and corals here. You breathe slowly, letting the cool night air mix with the scent of salt. The moon above you glows steady, quiet, yet suddenly you see it as part of something larger. A universal law written across countless worlds. Earth's tides link you to Europa's hidden seas, Enceladus's geysers, Titan's lakes. The physics is the same, the story repeated, just with different accents. You open your eyes and glance at the horizon, the waves folding in softly. They seem smaller now, almost fragile compared to the cosmic tides out there. But then you smile again. Small or not, these waves are yours. They are the version of the story written for Earth, for your beaches, your marshes, your nights of quiet walking. They are intimate, personal, and tonight, as you let the thought drift, you realize something tender. Tides might be one of the universe's ways of whispering, life belongs here. The tide has eased into its rhythm now, steady and predictable, but human imagination has never been content with just physics. You smile at the thought of how many stories, superstitions, and whispered fears have attached themselves to the moon and its pull on the sea. Long before anyone could scribble equations about gravity, people believed the moon ruled over moods, madness, even magic. And honestly, standing here with its silver glow shimmering across the water, you can almost understand why. The very word lunacy comes from lunar, the Latin for moon. For centuries, people insisted that the full moon stirred tempers, triggered madness, and even caused sudden outbursts of crime. Historians still argue whether this belief had any statistical truth or if it was just the result of brighter nights making mischief more visible. Either way, courts in medieval Europe sometimes actually reduced sentences if crimes happened under a full moon. The lunar influence was treated as a partial excuse, like blaming the weather for a bad haircut. You chuckle softly, picturing a medieval thief telling the judge, "It wasn't me, Your Honour, it was the moon." And the judge nodding solemnly, "Ah yes, of course, next case." The quirky detail is that in 19th century England, police officers were even issued extra pay if they worked on nights of the full moon, because it was assumed trouble would spike. Imagine filling out your timesheet today. Hazard bonus, moonlight. But superstition went deeper than crime. Folklore tied the moon's phases to everything from fertility to fishing luck. Some cultures believed babies born under a waxing moon would grow strong, while those born under a waning moon might be weaker. Farmers planted by lunar calendars convinced crops sprouted best when the tides of sap mirrored the tides of the sea. Historians still argue whether these practices ever boosted yields, or if they were just comforting rituals passed from one generation to the next. The tide brushes higher at your ankles, and you imagine villagers centuries ago gathering at the shoreline pointing at the moon's reflection in the water. To them, it wasn't just a rock in the sky, it was a mirror of destiny. Sailors refused to set off during certain lunar phases, fearing storms or shipwrecks. Witches, according to folklore, drew their power strongest during a full moon, using the tides as allies in their rituals. Even today, you hear echoes of it in movies and novels. The full moon always cast as accomplice to mystery. There's an odd little tidbit you recall. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, wrote that oysters grew in size with the waxing moon and shrank with its waning. He was wrong about a lot of things. This is the same man who recommended crushed mouse brains for toothaches. But his observation about oysters reflects how deeply people tied marine life to lunar cycles. It wasn't just waves, it was the creatures themselves, their very flesh and shell supposedly ruled by the moon. You wander past a patch of exposed driftwood, each piece twisted into strange shapes by the water, and you think about how imagination loves to fill in gaps. Without precise measurements, the moon became whatever people needed it to be: guardian, trickster, healer, villain. And honestly, even now with physics in hand, you feel the tug of its mystery. Who hasn't looked up at a full moon and felt something stir? Restlessness, awe, or maybe just an itch to do something reckless. Historians still argue whether the belief in lunar madness came from actual observation, like sleep cycles disturbed by the bright light, or if it was purely myth. Modern studies are inconclusive, though hospital staff still swap stories about crazy full moon nights. Whether true or not, the superstition refuses to fade, woven into human culture as tightly as the tides themselves. You tilt your head back and stare at the moon, bright and round, and you imagine all the stories tied to it. Wolves howling in forests, witches mixing potions, fishermen whispering prayers, lovers writing poetry. The moon doesn't just move oceans, it moves imagination, bending it the way gravity bends tides. And maybe that's why we've never let go of the folklore. It's comforting to think that something so steady and distant can also be personal, shaping not just waves but emotions, not just ecosystems but myths. The waves kiss the shore again, gentler this time, as though agreeing with your thought. You breathe slowly, letting the air settle deep in your lungs, and smile. Physics explains the tide, yes, but folklore explains us. And somewhere between the two, under the quiet glow of the moon, you find yourself lulled into that same old superstition. Maybe, just maybe, the moon really does know what's happening in your heart. The tide presses closer, and for the first time tonight you sense its other face. Not gentle rhythm, not fertile cycles, but raw danger. For as much as the moon moves water with quiet predictability, the sea it commands can still turn violent, and humans have often confused that violence with tides. Storm surges, tsunamis, floods, they've been lumped under the same word for centuries, as if the moon itself lost its temper and hurled waves at the shore. You close your eyes and imagine 1607 in England, when a massive flood swept through the Bristol Channel, drowning thousands. At the time, many believed it was caused by an extraordinary spring tide, the moon aligning with the sun to punish the sinful. Historians still argue whether it was really a storm surge amplified by spring tides, or even a tsunami triggered by a distant earthquake. Whatever the cause, the survivors told stories of walls of water taller than men, rushing inland faster than a horse could gallop. To them, the moon wasn't a serene companion, it was a force of terror. The quirky fact is that tsunamis, those colossal waves triggered by quakes or landslides, have nothing to do with tides at all. Yet for centuries, people called them tidal waves, confusion lingering even into modern times. You grin wryly at the thought, the moon taking the blame for every watery disaster, like some cosmic scapegoat. Imagine the moon sighing, "Seriously? I raise oceans twice a day for free, and you blame me for earthquakes now?" The thought grows heavier as you picture the 1953 North Sea flood, when a storm coincided with a spring tide and overwhelmed sea defences in the Netherlands and England. Whole villages vanished overnight, and the death toll reached into the thousands. That tragedy led to massive engineering projects like the Dutch Delta Works and the Thames Barrier, humanity's attempt to hold back the combined forces of weather and lunar pull. You glance out at the calm water tonight and shake your head. Peaceful as it seems, it's also the architect of nightmares when circumstances align. You wander farther down the beach where driftwood lies tangled like bones, and imagine how ancient cultures explained such disasters. Some believe they were divine punishment, others that sea monsters stirred beneath the waves. In Japan, folklore spoke of a giant catfish, namazu, thrashing underground and sending waves crashing ashore. Historians still argue whether these myths arose purely from fear, or if they served as coded warnings, reminders passed down through generations to respect the sea's volatility. Either way, the stories reveal the same truth. The moon may guide tides, but water answers to more than one master. The air smells sharper, tinged with brine and something metallic, and you remember another catastrophe, the 970 Bola cyclone in Bangladesh. The storm surge arriving during a high tide swallowed villages whole, killing hundreds of thousands. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in history, a grim reminder of how vulnerable coastlines are when storms borrow the moon's strength. You picture families clinging to palm trees, swept away when the tide gave the cyclone extra reach. In such moments, tides are not background music, they're amplifiers of destruction, and yet humans keep building by the shore, drawn to the sea's beauty despite its risks. You think of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, when levees broke and floodwaters surged through streets. Though not directly caused by tides, the disaster was worsened by the timing of high water. You smirk softly at the irony. People design skyscrapers to defy gravity, yet forget the moon has a daily appointment with the ocean right outside their doors. A quirky image pops into your head. Medieval villagers blaming a full moon for flooding, while modern engineers run computer models that say essentially the same thing, so spring tide plus storm equals trouble. We've traded superstition for spreadsheets, but the conclusion hasn't changed. Respect the moon, it will drown your fields. The waves lap gently now, as if mocking the disasters you've remembered, reminding you that destruction and calm are two faces of the same coin. You feel a shiver, not from cold, but from awareness. The same rhythm that rocks you towards sleep also has the power to erase entire towns. The moon is not malevolent, just impartial, a clock whose ticks can sometimes align with catastrophe. You breathe deeply, steadying yourself. The disasters remind you that tides are not a tame pet, but a force that shapes destiny. Yet even in tragedy, they've pushed humans to adapt, to build barriers, to learn prediction. Out of floods came charts, out of surges came science, out of terror came resilience. You glance up at the glowing moon, serene and unbothered, and whisper to yourself, it isn't the villain, it's the reminder. The sea listens to many voices, storms, quakes, winds, but it always dances to the moon's lead. And tonight, the dance is slow, quiet, mercifully gentle. The waves curl in and out at your feet, steady as a heartbeat. But behind that apparent simplicity lies a puzzle that still teases scientists. You'd think by now we'd have tides figured out completely. After all, we can predict eclipses centuries in advance. But tides, they're trickier. Models can tell you roughly when and where water will rise, but the details, how high exactly, how currents twist in a given bay, still resist full mastery. The moon's pull may be precise, but Earth's response is messy. Part of the complication is geography. Bays funnel water differently, Rivers interfere, winds stir the surface, and even the shape of the ocean floor shifts the rhythm. The Bay of Fundy in Canada, famous for its 50-foot tidal swings, still baffles experts trying to model its extremes. Historians still argue whether early explorers to the region thought the ocean itself was breathing there, or if they simply chalked it up to divine theatrics. Either way, we still don't perfectly predict every nuance today. You crouch by a tide pool, letting the cool water slip between your fingers, and think about the sheer audacity of trying to model the entire ocean. It's like predicting the mood swings of 1 billion people simultaneously. One moment the tide is higher than expected, the next lower. Oceanographers call these deviations tidal anomalies, and they still scratch their heads over why they happen in certain places. You grin at the thought. Humanity, armed with satellites and supercomputers, still occasionally mutters, "Oops, wrong again." The quirky fact is that some tidal predictions are still made using methods not much different from those of the 1800s. In those days, scientists like William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, built mechanical tide-predicting machines with pulleys and gears, little clockwork contraptions that simulated the moon and sun's pull. These devices, some looking like oversized sewing machines, were astonishingly accurate. Even today, digital models trace their lineage back to those whirring Victorian gadgets. Imagine asking your smartphone about tomorrow's tide and remembering that its great-grandparent was basically a box of brass wheels. But even with supercomputers, the ocean keeps its secrets. Some coastal areas experience amphidromic points, strange locations where there's virtually no tide at all, even though nearby shores rise and fall dramatically. The water there sloshes in complex circular patterns, cancelling itself out. Stand in such a spot, and you might wonder if the moon forgot about you entirely. Historians still argue when these oddities were first noticed, since ancient tide records rarely mention places where nothing happens. But they exist, quiet pockets of defiance in the moon's otherwise global command. You wander along the wet sand, and the moon looks down glowing smugly, as if enjoying the fact that we still haven't cracked all its riddles. Even now, debates continue over how much the sun contributes compared to the moon, how much Earth's tilt matters, how much shifting climate patterns amplify extremes. In 2011, for example, scientists were startled when unusually high tides struck parts of the Pacific, outpacing predictions. Was it the moon, the winds, subtle changes in sea level? The answer, frustratingly, was all of the above. A soft laugh escapes you. It's comforting in a way that the tides still resist total control. We can put rovers on Mars and probes beyond Pluto, but we can't say with perfect certainty what your local beach will look like at noon tomorrow. The moon keeps a few cards hidden, perhaps just to remind us not to get too cocky. Quirky stories come to mind, like how in the 20th century, British fishermen sometimes refused to trust official tide tables, insisting their grandfathers' weather-worn almanacs were better. They'd mutter, "The sea doesn't read the government's charts," and sometimes they were right. Even now, locals in certain coastal towns swear by personal observation over scientific data. The moon, it seems, has always favoured the humble eye as much as the clever equation. The night deepens, the water glistens, and you breathe slowly, realising the paradox. The tides are both utterly predictable and forever surprising. You know they will rise and fall, yet the details, how far, how fast, how fiercely, still leave room for mystery. Historians still argue whether that lingering unpredictability is weakness in our science, or just the ocean's way of reminding us that it's alive. The surf laps softly at your toes and you smile. Maybe it's better this way. If tides were fully tamed, fully mapped, maybe they would lose some of their wonder. The moon's pull is not just physics, it's also poetry, precisely because it eludes complete capture. Tonight, as the waves whisper at your feet, you feel content knowing that some mysteries remain. The tide has settled into its rhythm, neither extreme nor unpredictable now, just steady like a lullaby the moon hums to the earth. You stand still and let yourself sway with it, realizing you've walked through centuries, myths, disasters and discoveries, yet here the story is simple again. Water moves, moon pulls, you breathe. It's easy to forget that your body is mostly water too, quietly tuned to the same gravity. Maybe that's why the shoreline feels like home. You're not just visiting, you're resonating. You close your eyes and imagine yourself as part of the tide, carried outward on the ebb, swept back with the flood, belonging neither wholly to land nor sea. For a moment, the boundary between you and the waves blurs. That rhythm, the twice-daily breath of the planet, becomes your own. It feels eternal, yet you know it's fragile too, dependent on a moon that is slowly drifting away. Billions of years from now, the tides will weaken, the dance will slow, and the intimacy of this relationship will fade. But tonight, under this silver glow, you're living inside its perfect tempo. Historians still argue whether ancient poets sensed this same transience when they wrote about the sea's borrowed light. They couldn't know orbital mechanics, but perhaps they felt it, that the moon and earth are bound in a temporary embrace, one that will not last forever. The thought is bittersweet, like listening to your favourite song and knowing it will one day end. You step farther into the shallows, the water cool against your calves, and you picture the moon as a patient conductor guiding an orchestra that includes not only oceans but rivers, estuaries, salt marshes, reefs, and even the restless pulse of human imagination. Quirky reminder, some scientists have even joked that circadian rhythms, the way your body knows when to sleep, might owe more to ancient tidal cycles than to sunlight. Imagine yawning tonight and whispering thanks to the moon for scheduling your bedtime. The beach around you glistens, emptied of crowds, just sand, surf and sky. Every detail seems tuned to calm, the hush of waves, the faint cry of a gull bedding down, the whisper of grass at the dunes. The moon spills light like silk across the water, and you watch as each ripple catches it, like coins tossed endlessly onto the sea. You smile, realizing that for all the science, for all the charts and debates, the tide's greatest gift might be this: stillness in motion, a reminder that change itself can be soothing. You breathe deep, slow, letting your shoulders loosen, your thoughts drift. The moon, steady above, keeps tugging, and you surrender to it, letting the tide of drowsiness pull you under just as surely as it moves the ocean. You are part of the same cycle now, swaying with the water, with the planet, with the universe. The moon moves the tides, and tonight it moves you too, out of waking, into rest, into dreams. And now, as the last of the waves hush against the shore, the story begins to soften, like the tide itself receding into silence. You've walked a long way tonight, through myths now, and science, storms and calm, across beaches both real and imagined. But here, at the end, you don't need to hold on to any of it. Let the details slip away, the facts blur, the names dissolve, until all that's left is rhythm. The moon is still there, high above, steady and watchful. It doesn't ask anything of you, it doesn't demand shtiks, groove, or attention. It only hums the same song it has hummed for billions of years. A pull, a sway, a gentle reminder that everything moves in cycles. Your body knows this too. You have been swaying with each wave, breathing in time with the ocean without even trying. Let your thoughts drift like driftwood, carried by the tide. No need to steer, no need to cling. The water rises, the water falls, and with it your breath, your shoulders, your heartbeat. Whatever weight you've carried today can be set down here, on this shore, because the tide will take it, fold it into the sea, and bring you back only calm. Picture the horizon softening, the moon dimming slightly, the waves dissolving into whispers you can barely hear. The night is cool, safe, endless, and it belongs to you. You are held, you are steady, you are part of the tide. Now let go, let the moon keep watch, let the water breathe for you. Sleep is already here, rising like the tide. Drift with it, drift away, drift deep. Sweet dreams.